May the Lord be with you. This is Pastor Ryan coming to you on this May the 4th, Star Wars Day. And I realize that it might seem a bit gimmicky or gauche for a pastor to dedicate a reflection to pop culture, to science fiction. But nonetheless, I think there is great value in highlighting what Star Wars is, what it's meant for now several generations. Star Wars, of course, was created by the famous filmmaker George Lucas, who described himself as a Buddhist Methodist, a student of religions both East and West. And at one point, at least, he claimed that his goal in making the Star Wars trilogy, the original trilogy, was to show the value of religion to a younger generation. And indeed, the themes of faith, of wonder, of religion permeate the Star Wars trilogy, which is why its appeal appears so perennial. In a futuristic setting, a sort of gritty space opera, George Lucas tells stories of young boys, of wizards, of gods and monsters that feel ancient and timeless. And there's a reason for that. George Lucas was a student of Joseph Campbell, who was the 20th century's modern master of myth. Joseph Campbell wrote a lot about the importance of mythology for the human mind and for human society. You may have heard of the hero's journey. The hero's journey was this idea of Campbell's that behind every myth there is a monomyth, a basic structure that corresponds to reality, or at least how our minds interpret reality. And an oversimplified version of the hero's journey is that our hero, our character, starts out in a place of comfort, but wants something, desires something, and so sets off from home out into the unknown. There, he or she finds what they were looking for, but pays a heavy price and then returns home having changed. This is the structure of almost every great story, according to Joseph Campbell. You can clearly see it in The Lord of the Rings or in Disney Pixar's new film Onward. And of course, you can see it in Star Wars. By keeping one foot in the familiar and the orderly and one foot in the unknown and the chaotic, we risk danger but also discovery. That is the heart of the hero's journey. That is how we as human beings grow. And once we realize that this is a process always going on in our minds, either discovering or manufacturing meaning out of daily experiences, the balance between order and chaos, light and dark, then one sees why Star Wars has such perennial, wonderful appeal. Of course, another great influence on George Lucas was Akira Kurosawa, a Japanese filmmaker, brilliant man, did amazing work, and he too was a student of stories and of religion, both East and West. He's done amazing samurai films, and indeed, Akira Kurosawa loved Shakespeare. So if you ever get the chance to watch his version of Macbeth or his version of King Lear, you will see how, just like Joseph Campbell, just like George Lucas, Kurosawa interwove mythological and religious and storytelling themes, both East and West, and you can really see his influence on the Star Wars universe. Now, of course, I grew up loving Star Wars, reading the comics, reading the books, and it's funny how what used to be viewed as a very nerdy interest, a very nerdy pastime, is now incredibly mainstream. So much so that May the 4th, Star Wars Day, has in many ways become a legitimate holiday unto itself. And I think really George Lucas succeeded. And I think that's clear in just how much money the Star Wars series, the Star Wars stories, continue to make in our own day and age. We often think of ours as a secular age, at least in the West. But really, at heart, it's not. We are just as religious, just as much believers as ever we've been before. The difference, of course, is that in the late 20th and early 21st century, we've lost faith in institutions, be they governments, political parties, churches, bowling leagues, Boy Scouts, what have you. Anything that involves community commitment has been on the wane for decades. Um, Frankly, I think part of it is because it's simply easier to reach out virtually. It is easier to find our community online with less vulnerability, less risk. But of course, just because it's easier to find community online doesn't mean that it's necessarily better. We still crave community. We still crave human connection. Star Wars shows us that we are all thirsting for wonder, for mystery, for meaning, for weirdness, for adventure, for heroism. As I said, good and evil, gods and monsters. Bidden or not bidden, God is always present, according to Carl Jung, and he keeps coming back to us in strange and unexpected ways. You know, in the early church, of course, the great question was how Christianity would adapt, going from its original Jewish context into the greater world, which in the ancient and classical Near East was then the Hellenistic world, the Greek world. And some of the early Christians said, "Oh, what does Jerusalem have to do with Athens?" Which is to say, what could the Christian faith possibly have to do with Greek ideas, Greek culture, Greek philosophy? But the voices that won out said, just as God prepared the Jews for Christ by the law, the Old Testament, so he prepared the Greeks for Christ by philosophy. And Greek thought, Greek philosophy helped the church to flourish and to spread into new contexts, new cultures. Some of my favorite authors, J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, George MacDonald, they took this idea even further. They said that as God prepared the Jewish people for Christ by the law, as he prepared the Greeks by philosophy, so he prepared the barbarians, that is, the various tribes of Europe from which many of us descend, prepared the barbarians for Christ by mythology. That the great spiritual truths, the reason and the revelation that point to God, the yearnings, deepest longings of the human heart, these come out in our myths, in our stories, which is why they're so timeless, why we all love Greek mythology, Norse mythology, Irish Celtic mythology, and that these longings, these prophecies, are fulfilled in Jesus. C.S. Lewis, I believe it was, said that Christianity is the true myth. The stories that were written on our hearts, God fulfills by writing them in history with the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And I think that's still at play. The popularity of comic book superheroes, the Marvel Universe films, critics often dismiss this as puerile, as infantile, as kids who don't want to grow up. But in point of fact, I think what it is that these stories, drawing as they do from our Christian heritage, more so than from our pre-Christian or pagan heritage, in my opinion, these are fulfilling a need. These are fulfilling a longing. If you watch Marvel's Thor or Disney's Hercules or the Superman films, what do you have? You have a stranger from another world who comes down to Earth, who is raised as a human, and who eventually manifests his true divinity in dying for the ones he loves, laying down his life for the sheep. And by giving up his life for normal people, for vulnerable people, he is then raised from the dead, death having been conquered, to a new and glorified form. This is in all of these films, and yet it's clearly not a pagan story. That is a Christian story. The fact that we make movies about ancient gods like Thor and Hercules, and yet can only tell their story via death and resurrection, that just shows how Christ has fulfilled the longings of our myth-loving hearts. And of course, it's all through Hollywood, whether they realize it or not. The Matrix is a Christ story. RoboCop is a Christ story. All these great old stories point us to the greatest story ever told. Campbell may not have been right about the monomyth in the idea that there's one great myth from which all descend. No. But there may be one great myth to which all our myths point, all our myths long for fulfillment, and that is, as you might expect a pastor to say, Jesus Christ. Star Wars is in many ways deeply Christian. It's also, of course, deeply Buddhist, influenced by philosophy and Eastern religions as much as by Abrahamic religions. Nonetheless, there is great value in speaking to people of God, of the longing for meaning and purpose and value, the longing for transcendence and divinity, expressed in this medium, in film, in comics, even in cartoons. It may be kids' stuff in many ways, but again, C.S. Lewis said, a really good book that you enjoy at 10, you'll also enjoy at 30 and 40 and 50. A good kid's story is a good story, period. And I think that most of us would agree that applies to the Star Wars films. All of that said, may you have a very happy Star Wars day. May you raise a glass to the Buddhist Methodist George Lucas and to his tutors, Joseph Campbell, Akira Kurosawa, and may the Force be with you always, and also with you. Go in peace, serve the Lord, thanks be to God.